Hello and welcome to Local History on the History Fire channel. My name is Ben, and today we're going to be looking at the Rebecca Riots, which took place across Wales. The Rebecca Riots took place between 1839 and around 1843 in West and Mid Wales. They were a series of protests undertaken by local farmers and agricultural workers. This was in response to levels of taxation. The rioters, which were often men dressed as women, took their actions against toll gates, as they were tangible representations of taxes and tolls. The riots ceased prior to 1844 due to several factors, including increased troop levels, a desire by protesters to avoid violence, and the appearance of criminal groups using the guise of biblical character Rebecca for their own purposes. In 1844, an Act of Parliament to consolidate and amend the laws relating to turnpike trusts in Wales was passed. Now then, the events leading up to the riots. In the late 1830s and early 40s, the agricultural communities of West Wales were in dire poverty. In 1837 and 1838, the whole country suffered from poor harvests. Worse, though, in the southwest, where atrocious seasons of rain forced farmers to buy corn at famine prices to feed themselves, their animals and their families, which further eroded what little capital they had. Grain harvests collapsed, but the price of butter between 1837 and 41 and sheep between 39 and 41 were relatively high, and even the low cattle prices of 39 recovered by 41. But by 1842 a general fall in prices occurred throughout the agricultural markets that continued into 1843. Cattle prices slumped sharply in 1842, and the blame was placed firmly at the government's door, and in particular Robert Peel's tariff measures, which eased importation of foreign cattle and meat. In 1842 the harvest was one of the most successful in years, and that, combined with the contraction in demand from the Glamorgan ironworks, led to a slump in corn prices. The farmers' economic position had therefore shifted from that of dire grain harvests with life support for sheep and butter sales, to one where the price of their corn, when the weather was favourable, was very low. The diminution of the Glamorgan ironworks, coupled with the new tariff, also had an adverse effect on the prices of butter, cheese, pigs, horses, sheep and lean cattle, which impacted harshly on the Welsh pastoral farmer. The farmers were faced with a drastic reduction in their income, but had no financial relief in similar reductions in their outgoings, which were mainly rents, taxes, county rates, poor rates, and the turnpike tolls. Farm rents were mainly static, but the tolls and poor rates increased. Seeing themselves as victims of tyranny and oppression, the farmers and their workers took the law into their own hands to rid themselves of these taxes. The first institutions to be attacked were the hated toll gates. In the early 19th century, many toll gates on the roads in Wales were operated by trusts, which were supposed to maintain and improve the roads, funding this from tolls. However, many trusts charged high tolls, but spent the money on other things. Even where this was not done, the toll gate laws imposed an additional financial burden on poor farming communities. The oppression felt by the farmers began in the late 1830s, when a group of toll renters took over the region's trusts. This group was led by Thomas Bullen, who was hated by those who paid this toll. The main reason for his dislike was the exacting method of the toll collection and the big toll increases of sidebars. The sidebars were simply toll gates away from the main trunk roads, placed strategically on byroads to catch any traffic that had tried to bypass the main toll booths via the side lanes. These sidebars dramatically increased the cost of farmers carting lime to their fields to fertilize or to reduce acidity in the soil. It was said that it cost 10 times as much as the lime itself to cart it from Cardiff docks to a farm in the hills. The first appearance of Rebecca, or Becca as the members called themselves, occurred in 1839, although this precedes the economic events of 1842. The early appearances of Rebecca were sporadic, isolated outbursts, with the true body of rioting not beginning until the winter of 1842. Although these early uprisings were few and uncommon, they were the first appearance of mobs dressed in the guise of Rebecca. These gangs became known as the Rebeccas. The toll gates would then be destroyed. Although not all members of the mob would wear women's clothes, those that did, often in white gowns, would also blacken their faces or wear masks. The attacks were accompanied by much noise, and in the earliest, a mock trial would also take place. The accepted leader of the first protests, Thomas Rees, wore women's clothes when leading attacks. Some versions of the story say that these were borrowed from a woman called Rebecca, living near his home at the foot of the Preseli Hills. The story states that the woman was an old maid and her clothes were borrowed because she was the only woman tall enough and large enough in the village. The Rebecca riots were a response not only against the toll gates but also other factors affecting Welsh farming communities. The toll gates were chosen as the most tangible representation of the system the rioters could despise. Their only other option would be the union workhouses, as the poor law was as hated as the toll roads. But these could be easily defended and were often garrisoned by troops. The first protest, led by Rebecca, destroyed the toll gates at Eirfirian Wen in 2 attacks in Carmarthenshire in 1839. These were believed to be led by Tom, though he does not appear to participate in further riots when the attacks flared again 3 years later. Other communities later adopted the name and disguise, and other grievances besides the toll gates were aired in the riots. Anglican clergymen with the established Church of England were targets on several occasions. The Church of England would demand tithes and other taxes, even though most of the population of Wales were nonconformists. Other victims were petty local villains, such as the fathers of illegitimate children. The next time the Rebeccas assembled was roughly 3 years later, when Tom Bullen was allowed to raise the toll gate by the Mermaid Tavern near St. Clears. This was an obvious trap sidebar, and angered the locals who destroyed it and 2 other gates. Other toll gates to be targeted included the Bolgoed toll gate on the outskirts of Pontarddulais, and on the 6th of July 1843 the Bolgoed toll gate was attacked and destroyed by a group of some 200 men. In mid-July 1843, letters were sent by representatives of the Rebeccas, targeting the landlords of farmers, and thus reflecting a shift away from the focus on toll gates alone towards more general grievances against the landlord class. These threatening letters warned the landlords to make reductions in their rent of their tenant farmers. The summer of 1843 also saw farmers conducting open meetings, demanding a lowering of rent by at least a third. The threats came to little, and the meetings had no effect, and the rents remained the same, although by August farmers had changed tactics to calling for an independent assessment of the regulations of rents. Excuse me. The riots resulted in at least one murder in the small village of Hendy on the 7th of September 1843, in which a young woman and gatekeeper named Sarah Williams was killed. She had been warned beforehand that the rioters were on their way, but refused to leave. And on the night of her death she could be heard shouting, "I know who you are," by a family living up the road, who locked their doors from the rioters. Williams called for help at the house of John Thomas, a labourer, to extinguish her fire at the toll gate, but when she returned to the toll house, a shot was heard. Williams returned to the house of John Thomas and collapsed at the threshold of the house. 2 minutes later, she was dead. From August 1843, local and open protest meetings were taking the place of riots, partly due to the farmers scaling back on violent activity, and also due to the increasing presence of troop numbers. Another major factor that saw the riots reduce were the activities of a group of petty criminals masquerading as Rebeccas, often operating from the 5 roads near Llanelli. This group, led by known troublemaker John Jones and his associate David Davis, who were eventually convicted and transported to Australia, turned more respectable people away from Rebecca. Jones, unlike Davis, was not convicted of crimes during the riots, but was later charged on an assault charge. By late 1843, the riots had stopped, although Rebecca had failed to produce an immediate effect on the lives of the farmers she had sought to serve. The very nature of a leaderless uprising of the downtrodden peasantry in an attempt to obtain justice from an unfair system was an important socio-political event within Wales. In the aftermath of the riots, some rent reductions were achieved, the toll rates were improved, and the protests prompted several reforms, including a royal commission into the question of toll roads, which led to the Turnpikes, South Wales Act 1844. This act consolidated the trusts, simplified the rates, and reduced the hated toll on line movement by half. More importantly, the riots inspired later Welsh protests. These included opposition to the privatisation of salmon reserves on the River Wye in the 1860s and 70s, which became known as the Second Rebecca Riots, and the formation in the 1970s of the radical arts collective known as the Becca Group. And there we have the story of the Rebecca Riots. Thank you very much for watching, and join us later or soon for some more local history from the History Fella channel. Goodbye.